Today, we are stepping right into a profound, highly structured look at statecraft, war, and objective morality. We're going to unpack something called biblical realism. Now, this isn't some modern political manifesto. Rather, it's a document that builds a really rigorous theological lens for viewing global conflicts. Our goal here is to just impartially map out this exact worldview and look at how the authors use scripture to define the boundaries of human empathy, state power, and divine justice.
Okay, let's dive into this. Every framework has a starting point, right? Well, for the biblical realist, literally everything begins with this absolute, non-negotiable premise. God is the sovereign creator. The text argues that because God is the author of life, he alone holds the authority to define what justice is and when force is legitimate. We aren't starting with international law or human rights charters here. According to this document, we are starting with the assertion that reality itself is authored by a divine sovereign. So here is our roadmap for today. 1. The biblical realist premise. 2. Defining divine justice. 3. The mandate of the sword. 4. Justice versus human sentiment. And 5. The just war conclusion. Let's start with section 1, the biblical realist premise. The text constructs its entire argument on a very specific assumption about the world. You see, this framework views everything through what theologians call a fallen world. Basically, a state where humanity exists in active rebellion against its creator. And because of this rebellion, the document asserts that human institutions, specifically the state, aren't just neutral administrative actors. Relying on biblical passages like Romans chapter 13, the text argues the state is actually a divinely ordained institution. It's been given a very sober, heavy mandate from God to actively restrain wickedness and uphold order in a fractured world. Moving on to section 2, defining divine justice. Now, this source fundamentally redefines what we typically hear in modern conversations. According to this framework, divine justice is the objective moral standard derived entirely from Scripture. And crucially, this is a big one, this standard prioritizes the preservation of justice over the mere preservation of human life at any cost. This is a massive departure from secular humanism, really establishing that in this worldview, moral rightness is absolutely not the same thing as absolute pacifism. To back this up, the author points directly to the biblical text of Genesis 9:6. The framework interprets this ancient directive about the shedding of blood not just as some historical rule, but as a permanent judicial requirement for human society. It argues that God literally demands a specific, forceful response to acts of extreme violence in order to maintain the moral fabric of the world. That brings us to section 3, the mandate of the sword. In this framework, the state acts as God's agent, authorized to wield the sword to punish evil. And the text uses a very specific modern example to illustrate this. It argues that when a regime or entity, and it explicitly names Hamas here, commits mass premeditated slaughter, they aren't just viewed as political actors navigating a conflict. No. According to the document, they become violators of the divine order, which triggers the state's duty to respond with the sword. So, the crucial point is this. Under the biblical realist framework, inaction is absolutely not seen as the moral high ground. If a state refuses to act against an aggressor, the text argues it is actually failing its God-ordained stewardship. By refusing to use the sword, the state allows the full measure of iniquity to triumph. In this worldview, stepping back from the sword when facing extreme evil is a profound biblical failure. Let's look at section 4, justice versus human sentiment. The framework argues that modern critics often fall into what it calls the idolatry of sentiment. This happens when people judge the legitimacy of a war based primarily on the result, the pain, the suffering, and the death involved. But the document contrasts this with divine justice, which insists that conflicts must be judged by their cause, specifically the justice of the defense. While the text acknowledges that compassion for suffering is totally natural, it asserts that making human empathy the supreme moral judge ignores the harsh biblical reality that force is sometimes required to constrain a fallen world. The text takes this critique a step further, labeling emotional appeals and secular humanism as the error of human-centric moralizing. The document claims that by elevating human empathy above scriptural mandates, modern critics are actually usurping God's role. They're taking it upon themselves to be the ultimate judge, swapping out a divine standard of justice for their own human feelings. And this brilliantly illustrates the framework's accusation of moral inversion. The document argues that a critic is biblically inconsistent if they condemn a nation's defense but remain completely silent on the initial act of aggression. To judge the defender by the exact same metric as the aggressor, the text argues, is to reject the fundamental biblical distinction between justice and wickedness. In this view, the guilt of war always lies with the one who shatters the peace, not the one forced to step in and restore order.
Finally, Section 5, the just war conclusion. The author insists that the whole concept of a just war cannot be based on United Nations resolutions or popular opinion. Instead, it must be filtered strictly through Sola Scriptura, meaning by Scripture alone. This, the document argues, is the only way for a devout Christian to maintain a consistent approach to global conflict. By filtering just war through Scripture, the framework argues you avoid two massive pitfalls. Step 1 is avoiding the error of moral vanity. This is the recognition that war is never a humanitarian success story. It is always a grim tragedy. Justice must be demanded, for sure, but without giving in to pride or malice. Step 2 is avoiding the error of moral abandonment. This means outright rejecting pacifism or isolationism. As the text vividly puts it, in a world of wolves, the shepherd absolutely must carry a staff and a rod to protect the flock. To summarize the core tensions of this worldview, the text outlines 3 alignments with divine truth. First, that war is authorized by God specifically to restrain evil. Second, that the state wielding this power is completely accountable to God for how it uses it. And third, that human opinion, no matter how intensely emotional it might be, is always secondary to the objective standard of divine justice. Which brings us to the source's final claim. The document posits that the pro-Israel just war position isn't argued as being flawless, because, well, human institutions are always flawed. Rather, it claims this position is the only one that fully acknowledges the reality of a fallen world and the absolute necessity of acting as God's agent to restrain the wicked. The text concludes that supporting the defense of the innocent isn't being judgmental, it's simply a refusal to redefine God's morality. We've thoroughly mapped out this biblical realist framework today, from its premise of a sovereign creator to its mandate of the sword and its stark contrast between divine justice and human emotion. It leaves us with a profound tension to consider. So, we'll end on this thought. In a modern world increasingly driven by human empathy and emotional responses, is it truly possible to reconcile our human sentiment with an absolute, objective framework of justice? Something to think about.